At my wedding, my fiancé's family pointed at my mother and laughed. "Look at that miserable poor woman," her father sneered. Then my bride grabbed a garden hose and said, "Maybe I should wash the poverty off her." I stepped in front of her, removed my ring, and said, "The wedding is over, and by sunrise, your family will no longer have an empire." The first blast of cold water hit my mother's face before I even understood why the guests were laughing. Her gray dress soaked through in seconds, clinging to her shoulders. Her white hair stuck to her cheeks in thin strands. And Alyssa, my bride, 4 minutes from becoming my wife, stood there holding the garden hose steady in both hands, grinning like she'd just told the funniest joke of the night. "Would you look at that?" Charles Whitmore called from the terrace, lifting his champagne glass so the sun caught it. "Look at that miserable poor woman. She looks like she wandered here from a bus station." The guests laughed with him, 200 of them, under white canopies, most with drinks already in hand. I ran to my mother. She was shaking, both hands pressed to her face, trying to wipe water out of her eyes without smearing what was left of her makeup. "Danny, please," she whispered. "Not today. Don't ruin your wedding." That broke something in me. She was the one soaked and humiliated, standing in front of 200 strangers in a dress that had gone see-through at the shoulders, and she was still worried about my day. Alyssa lifted the hose again, testing the pressure with her thumb over the nozzle. "Relax. Maybe I should wash the poverty off her." I stepped in front of my mother. The water hit my chest instead, soaking through my white dress shirt in one cold sheet. "Put it down," I said. "Don't be dramatic. Everyone knows it's a joke." A drone camera hovered somewhere above the canopy, the one Alyssa's family had hired to film aerial shots of the ceremony for the wedding video. It was still running. The string quartet had stopped playing somewhere in the last 30 seconds, the cellist's bow frozen mid-stroke. I pulled off my ring. Alyssa's smile disappeared. "What are you doing?" "The wedding's over," I said, "and by sunrise, your family won't own a single thing." Charles laughed so hard he nearly spilled his drink onto his rented tuxedo. "Our empire? You're a consultant who drives a 6-year-old Honda Accord." He had no idea. I'd been dating Alyssa for 6 months when I met her father for the first time, at a dinner in a private room at a restaurant he owned 12% of. I was 28, working what I'd told her was a consulting job that doesn't really have a title, and I sat through that dinner nodding along while Charles Whitmore explained, unprompted, exactly how much smarter he was than everyone else in the room. For 2 years, I let the Whitmores believe I was some ordinary guy lucky to marry into money. I sat through Charles's dinners. I reviewed his contracts when he asked, because it turned out I was good at that, better than he expected from a boyfriend with an unclear job. I listened to him brag about hotels and acquisitions the way other men brag about golf handicaps. He never once asked why 3 banks approved emergency credit for his failing company in 48 hours, back when a renovation project in Scottsdale went sideways, and he needed $11 million by Friday, or he'd lose the property to a lien. He never asked who really controlled Northbridge Capital, the investment firm quietly propping up his entire business behind a wall of holding companies with names like River Towns and Dead Poets. And he never asked why my mother, Eleanor Cho, worth more than his entire estate on her worst day, wore a plain gray dress to her son's wedding, instead of anything that photographed the way money is supposed to photograph. My mother built Northbridge from a 2-room office above a dry cleaner in Fullerton, 18 months after my father died of a heart attack at 44. She avoided cameras. She avoided headlines. She kept her name off every document she could get her name off of, because she'd learned early that a woman running a lending firm got asked different questions than a man did, and she was tired of answering them. When she handed the company's day-to-day operations to me 2 years ago, quietly, on paper, through a family trust neither Charles nor Alyssa ever thought to ask about, almost nobody outside our lawyers knew. Charles only knew Northbridge as the firm that saved his hotels after 3 failed projects. He knew it the way you know a river that happens to run past your property. Useful, background, not something you interrogate. He didn't know I'd spent 8 months quietly documenting exactly what he'd done with our money. It started small. I was reviewing quarterly disbursement reports for the Whitmore Grand in Scottsdale, a courtesy Charles asked for, since I was in the industry now, or so he liked to say at dinner, and the contractor invoices didn't match the completion percentages in the project file. I told myself it was nothing. Construction projects run over. Invoices get miscategorized. I'd seen sloppier bookkeeping from firms 3 times Northbridge's size. Then I pulled the actual contractor licenses. 2 of the 3 general contractors listed on the Scottsdale renovation didn't hold active licenses in Arizona. One of them shared a business address with Charles's younger brother, Peter Whitmore, in a strip mall outside Tempe that also housed a nail salon and a tax preparer. My stomach dropped the way it does when you're driving, and the car in front of you brakes for no reason you can see yet. I told myself there was probably a simple explanation. Maybe the licenses were pending renewal. Maybe I had the wrong entity name. I spent an evening pulling every permutation of Peter's contracting business I could find registered in Maricopa County. There were 3. None of them held an active general contractor license. One had been suspended for an unpaid workers' compensation judgment 2 years earlier and never reinstated. I brought it up carefully at dinner, framing it as a question about vendor diversification, something a consultant might ask, not something a son-in-law investigator investigating fraud, might ask. Charles waved it off without even looking up from his plate. Family helps family. Peter needed the work. Sure, I said, just making sure the paperwork's clean for the refinance. The paperwork's fine, he said, in the tone of a man who has never once been asked to prove that. Worry about your own department. I let it go, for now, but I started keeping a folder. 6 weeks later, Northbridge needed to refinance the Scottsdale property, which meant a new appraisal. I was the one who requested it, since by then Charles had started routing more of the boring paperwork, as he called it, through me directly, a courtesy that would end up being the worst mistake he ever made. The appraisal came back at $34 million. The number felt wrong the moment I saw it. I'd walked that property. I'd seen the water damage on the 4th floor that housekeeping was still fielding complaints about. I told myself the appraiser probably had access to comps I didn't. Appraisers are professionals. That's the whole point of hiring one. Then I found the appraiser's license had been suspended 11 months earlier by the Arizona Board of Appraisal for an unrelated valuation dispute and reinstated on a technicality 2 weeks before he was hired for the Scottsdale job. His fee, $47,000 for a single appraisal, nearly 4 times the market rate, had been paid not by the hotel entity, but by a shell company called Riverstone Holdings LLC, which I eventually traced back to Charles personally through a Delaware registered agent filing that listed Charles's home address as the principal office. My hands were shaking when I closed the laptop that night, not from fear yet, from the specific physical sensation of watching a floor you thought was solid turn out to be painted on. I drove to the property myself the next morning before work, walked the 4th floor again, took photos of the water damage on my phone, the warped baseboard, the ceiling stains shaped like a continent nobody would ever name. Then I compared the timestamp on my photos to the appraisal date. The appraiser had signed off on a recently renovated no deferred maintenance condition report 6 days after I'd personally seen a bucket catching drips in room 412. I raised it with Charles again, more directly this time, laying out the timeline without accusing him of anything yet. Just numbers, just dates. He told me I was overthinking the numbers business, and that I should let the people who'd been doing this for 30 years handle valuations. You're a smart kid, Danny, but you don't know hotels. I'm not trying to know hotels, I said. I'm trying to understand a $34 million number. He laughed and told Alyssa right in front of me that I was getting paranoid. Must be the wedding stress. Alyssa laughed too and told me later that night I should really try to relax more around her father. I said I would. I didn't mean it. This is the one that made me stop rationalizing. The Whitmore Hotel Group's employee pension fund, money belonging to housekeepers, maintenance staff, front desk workers, some of whom had been with the company since before I was born, had been used as collateral on a $6.2 million bridge loan Charles took out to cover a shortfall on a different property entirely, a boutique hotel in Sedona that was hemorrhaging money. I found this because the loan document crossed my desk for a completely unrelated reason. Charles wanted Northbridge to consider taking over the note, and buried in the collateral schedule, on page 14 of a document he clearly hadn't expected anyone at Northbridge to actually read closely, was a line item, pledged asset, Whitmore Hotel Group Employee Retirement Trust, account IRPOR 71B. Using pension money as collateral without the consent of the plan, participants isn't a gray area. It's a violation of fiduciary duty under ERISA, and depending on how deliberately it was structured, it can be a federal crime. I sat in my car in the Northbridge parking garage for 40 minutes before I could make myself drive home. I thought about Marisol, who'd worked the front desk at the Whitmore Grand for 19 years and had shown me pictures of her granddaughter's christening the last time I'd stopped by the property. I thought about how her retirement was sitting on a spreadsheet as collateral for a hotel that couldn't make its own payroll. I tried once to fix it quietly through the actual channel that existed for exactly this kind of problem. I drafted a 2-page memo to Charles, copying our internal Northbridge Credit Committee, recommending that any further extension of credit to the Whitmore Hotel Group be conditioned on immediate release of the pension trust as collateral, citing the ERISA fiduciary concerns in plain, non-accusatory language. I spent most of a Sunday getting the tone right, informational, not adversarial, the kind of memo a cautious junior partner writes, not the kind an investigator writes. Charles rejected it in a 2-line email, sent 9 minutes after I hit send, CC line stripped down to just the 2 of us. Not necessary. Handle the Sedona numbers. That's the priority. I read that email 4 or 5 times that night, the way you reread a text message looking for a version of it that says something different than what it actually says. It didn't change. He'd been asked directly on paper, and he'd said no. I kept the email. I kept everything from that point forward. 3 months before the wedding, Charles called me into his office and asked me to clean up some old paperwork before the ceremony. Old contract drafts, old appraisal versions, some correspondence he described as just clutter that doesn't need to follow us into the next chapter. He wanted the old versions gone, quietly shredded, no questions asked. He said it lightly, like he was asking me to tidy a garage before guests came over. I told myself one more time that maybe this really was just clutter. Maybe I was seeing conspiracy in ordinary corporate housekeeping. Then I actually read what he wanted shredded and understood immediately why he wanted it gone before he became father-in-law father-in-law to the person who controlled Northbridge Capital. Draft after draft of the Scottsdale renovation budget showed the same contractor invoices being altered after the fact. Dollar figures increased by exactly the amount that matched Peter Whitmore's strip mall business account deposits. The version history wasn't clutter. It was a paper trail of fraud in progress, and Charles wanted it gone specifically because his sons-in-law-to-be now had eyes on all of it. I made copies of everything. I kept them somewhere he'd never think to look. A safe deposit box under my mother's maiden name, at a bank Charles had never done business with in his life. I didn't shred a single page. I photographed everyone first. The last piece fell into place 5 weeks before the wedding, and it was the one that hurt the most because it wasn't Charles's name on the document. It was hers. Alyssa's name was listed on nearly $1 million in consulting fees, $940,000, paid out over 14 months to a company called AWL Strategic Partners for brand consulting services on the Scottsdale and Sedona properties. I asked her about it once carefully, framing it as small talk about her career. She laughed and said she didn't really do much for it. Dad just needed to move money somewhere convenient. It's basically a gift. Don't make it weird. I didn't make it weird. I made a copy of the AWL contract instead and noted that the brand consulting description had been added to the filing 8 months after the payment started, right around the time Northbridge began asking more detailed questions about disbursements. By then, I had 8 months of documentation, redirected renovation funds funneled into shell companies tied to Charles's brother, faked occupancy numbers reported to lenders to justify valuations. A pressured, previously suspended appraiser paid 4 times market rate through a personal shell company. Employee pension money pledged as collateral without authorization. Money belonging to hundreds of hotel workers who trusted the man signing their paychecks. And nearly $1 million laundered through his daughter's name for consulting work that never happened. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't need to yet. I needed the wedding to happen because the trust documents that finalized my full, unrestricted control of Northbridge Capital, control my mother had been quietly transferring to me for 2 years, contingent on a set of conditions we'd agreed on together, completed exactly 1 week before the ceremony. I wasn't marrying into the Whitmore's world for status. I was marrying into it as the one person alive who could see all of it clearly. At the exact moment I finally had the authority to act on what I saw. I just never expected the last straw to be a garden hose aimed at my mother's face. "Walk away now and you lose everything," Charles said, following us across the lawn as I wrapped my jacket around my mother's shoulders and walked her toward the car. "The apartment, your job. I made your career." I stopped and turned around. 200 guests were watching now, drinks forgotten, the drone still hovering somewhere above us with a memory card that was about to become the single most viewed piece of footage of Charles Whitmore's life for reasons he could not yet imagine. That was what he actually believed, that I was a guy he'd elevated, that my mother, standing there in a soaked gray dress with her hair plastered to her face, was some relative he was generously tolerating. He didn't know I'd spent 8 months quietly documenting exactly what he'd done with our money. He didn't know that Northbridge Capital, his lifeline, his rescue, his quiet benefactor through 3 failed projects, belonged, as of 1 week ago, entirely to the son-in-law he'd just watched his daughter humiliate a woman in front of. "You should sit down, Charles," I said. "This is going to be a long night for you." I got my mother into the car. Her hands were still trembling, but she'd stopped shaking the way she had on the lawn, the way someone stops shaking once they realize the worst part is actually over. I called my attorney before I'd even pulled out of the circular drive. "Rebecca," I said, watching Alyssa rip off her veil through the windshield, the tool catching on the pins in her hair. "Release the files." Rebecca Alvarez had been my mother's attorney for 11 years before she became mine, a former SEC enforcement lawyer who'd left government work to specialize in exactly this kind of thing, financial fraud dressed up as family business. She didn't ask me to repeat myself. "All of it?" she said. "Alvarez, Chen, and Osei have had the full document set staged for 6 weeks. Say the word and it goes to the bank compliance officers, the pension plan administrator, and 2 financial reporters within the hour. All of it," I said. "Now." By the time we reached the Northbridge offices, it was already spreading. Someone at the wedding had posted a 20-second clip. Alyssa spraying an elderly woman with a garden hose, Charles laughing from the terrace, 200 guests cheering along in the background, and it had already crossed 400,000 views by the time I sat down at my desk, still in my soaked dress shirt. Rebecca met us there with 2 other people I hadn't met yet, both of whom would spend the next 6 weeks becoming very familiar names in my life. The first was Marcus Feldman, a forensic accountant with the firm Alvarez, Chen, and Osei had retained 8 months earlier, around the same time I'd started keeping my own records, to build an independent financial trail behind everything I'd been documenting. Marcus had spent 22 years reconstructing exactly this kind of fraud for litigation, and he'd built a chain of custody file so thorough that a defense attorney would later describe it, in a filing meant to be dismissive, as aggressively comprehensive. We have 3 years of disbursement records, the full Scottsdale contractor payment history, the Riverstone Holdings shell structure, and the AWL Strategic Partners contract, Marcus said, sliding a folder across the table. Every Every dollar traces. Nothing here is circumstantial. The second was Detective Priya Nandakumar of the County Financial Crimes Unit, 17 years with the department, the last 9 in white-collar investigations. Rebecca had brought her in as a courtesy contact 2 weeks earlier. Once it became clear the pension fund misuse alone would likely trigger a federal referral regardless of what else happened. ERISA violations involving pension collateral usually go to the Department of Labor first, Detective Nandakumar told me, flipping through the pension trust documents Marcus had flagged. But given the scale here, $6.2 million in unauthorized collateral, plus what looks like appraisal fraud used to secure separate financing, this crosses into wire fraud and possibly bank fraud territory. That's federal, and that's the FBI's Financial Crimes Squad, not just my unit. How fast does that move? I asked. Once we make the referral, faster than you'd think, especially with documentation this clean. She tapped the folder. This isn't a case that needs to be built. It's a case that needs to be filed. The third was someone I hadn't expected to need. Diane Osei, one of the founding partners at the firm who specialized in employee benefits litigation. She'd been read into the pension situation the moment Marcus flagged it, because the hotel workers whose retirement money had been pledged as collateral were about to become the most sympathetic and most legally protected people in this entire story, and someone needed to be representing their interests specifically, not just mine or my mother's. There are 211 plan participants, Diane said. Housekeeping staff, maintenance, front desk, some kitchen workers. The average balance affected is around $34,000. For some of them, particularly the ones near retirement, that's not an abstraction. That's the difference between retiring and not. I thought about Marisol again. I hadn't told anyone at the firm about her specifically. I didn't need to. She was one of 211 now, and all 211 were about to have lawyers who worked for people other than Charles Whitmore, possibly for the first time in their working lives. There was a fourth person at the table by 11 p.m., someone Rebecca had looped in an hour earlier by phone, Harold Ibsen, a former bank examiner who now consulted on regulatory referrals for firms exactly like ours, 26 years split between the OCC and private practice. His job that night was narrow but essential, walking through, line by line, exactly which findings needed to go to which regulator and in what order, so that nothing we did could later be characterized as selective disclosure. You want the Department of Labor notified about the pension collateral independently of anything else that happens tonight, Harold said, making notes on a legal pad instead of a laptop, an old habit he apparently hadn't shaken. That filing should not depend on the media cycle, the bank's timeline, or the criminal referral. If it looks coordinated with a PR strategy, it undermines the participant's claim later. Send it clean, send it first, and don't mention the wedding video anywhere in the notification. Understood, Diane said, already drafting. Marcus spent the next hour walking Detective Nandakumar through the exhibit binder in full, not summarizing it, actually walking her through source documents one at a time, because he'd learned over 2 decades that investigators trust a paper trail they've been shown, not one they've been told about. Bank wire confirmations for the Riverstone Holdings payments cross-referenced against the appraiser's disciplinary timeline. The Scottsdale contractor invoices next to the Maricopa County licensing database printouts. The AWL Strategic Partners contract, its metadata showing the brand consulting services description, had been added in a file revision 8 months after the first payment cleared. This is a clean chain, Detective Nandakumar said finally, closing the binder. I've seen financial fraud referrals that take investigators 8-9 months just to establish what you've laid out here in one folder. That's going to move fast. Not everyone in that room was purely on my side, and I want to be honest about that, because the story is more believable if I am. Diane, in particular, made clear in the first 10 minutes that her obligation was to the plan participants, not to me or to Northbridge's reputation. If it turns out Northbridge Capital had any awareness the pension fund was being used as collateral and didn't flag it to regulators sooner, that's a conversation we're going to need to have separately, she told me flatly in front of everyone. I'm not assuming you're clean just because you brought the documents forward. It was fair. I let Marcus walk her through the full timeline. When I'd first found the collateral schedule, the rejected memo, the email Charles sent back reading not necessary, handle the Sedona numbers, and by the end of it she seemed satisfied that I'd raised it internally and been overruled, not that I'd sat on it. But she made me sit through the scrutiny first, and she was right to. By midnight, we had exhibits labeled through Exhibit M bank records, contractor licensing printouts from the Arizona Board of Contractors, the suspended and reinstated appraiser's disciplinary file from the Arizona Board of Appraisal, the Riverstone Holdings LLC formation documents, filed in Delaware 11 days before the Scottsdale appraisal was ordered, the AWL Strategic Partners contract with its retroactively edited service description, and the pension trust document page 14, the collateral schedule that had started all of it for me. I had 24 hours before the Monday markets opened, and Charles's holding company had a covenant on a separate credit facility, unrelated to Northbridge, that would trigger an automatic default review the moment any of the 3 banks involved got wind of pending fraud allegations. Rebecca explained it to me at at around 1 a.m., when the adrenaline that had carried me since the lawn had started to curdle into something closer to nausea. Once we notify the banks, which we have to do given our own fiduciary exposure through Northbridge, the covenant trips automatically, she said. You have a window, maybe 18 hours, before this becomes completely public and completely out of anyone's control, including yours. What happens in that window? Right now, it's still primarily a viral wedding video and a family scandal. Once the banks move, it's a securities and pension fraud case with a paper trail a mile long, and reporters who cover exactly that kind of story are going to want confirmation, comment, documents. You need to decide tonight exactly how much of this you release and to whom, because you don't get to walk it back after. I hadn't eaten since the ceremony. Someone had put a paper cup of coffee in front of me hours earlier and I hadn't touched it, and when I finally picked it up, my hand was unsteady enough that I set it back down without drinking. 18 hours. I kept doing the math in my head. What time it would be when the covenant tripped, what time zone the reporters worked in, whether Marisol would be at the front desk when this broke or home asleep, whether she'd hear it from a co-worker before she heard it from anyone official. My hands wouldn't stop shaking, and this time it wasn't from anger. It was the specific, cold understanding that whatever I did in the next few hours, my mother's name, the name she'd spent 30 years keeping off headlines, was going to end up in print regardless of what I chose. The only real choice left was whether it appeared as the villain's excuse or as the truth. Send everything to the pension plan administrator first, I said, before the banks, before the reporters. Those 211 people should not find out their retirement was at risk from a news article. Diane nodded, already typing. That's the right call. It's also required. DOL notification takes priority the moment we have actionable knowledge. At 3:40 a.m., Charles texted me a photo. He was still in the boardroom of his own headquarters, Alyssa beside him, still in her wedding gown, both of them smiling for the camera like they'd already won something. The caption read, "You chose the wrong family to threaten." He still didn't understand what was happening. I didn't respond. There wasn't anything left to say that the documents weren't already saying for me. By 6 a.m., wedding footage had crossed 2 million views. 2 of Charles's 3 hotel board directors had resigned by email overnight, citing irreconcilable concerns about financial oversight, in language careful enough that any lawyer could see it meant exactly what it sounded like it meant. By 9 a.m., one of the 3 banks, the one holding the largest exposure on the Sedona Bridge loan, had frozen further disbursements pending an internal audit, and formally requested Northbridge's full disbursement file, which Rebecca had ready within the hour because we'd built it 8 months earlier for exactly this moment. At noon, Detective Nandakumar called to confirm the county had referred the pension collateral matter to the FBI's Financial Crimes Squad, given the interstate wire transfers involved in the Riverstone holding structure. "This moves fast from here," she said. "Federal financial fraud cases with documentation this clean don't sit on anyone's desk for long." By that evening, a business reporter at a regional outlet who covered hospitality industry finance had confirmed through her own sources at one of the banks that Charles Whitmore was under active review for pension fund misuse and appraisal fraud. She reached out to Rebecca for comment. Rebecca gave her exactly 3 sentences, all fact, no editorializing, and directed her to the public regulatory filings that were about to exist regardless of anything we said. 2 weeks later, the Department of Labor issued a formal notice of investigation into the Whitmore Hotel Group's pension plan. Diane Osie's firm was retained to represent the plan participants in a related civil action to recover the improperly pledged funds, and within a month, the pension trust had been made whole, not because Charles agreed to anything, but because the banks, protecting their own exposure, forced a settlement that included immediate release and restoration of the pension collateral as a condition of not calling the entire credit facility. Marisol got her $34,000 back with interest. I found out later through Diane, not directly. I never met her again after that day at the front desk, and I decided that was the right amount of distance to keep. Charles was indicted 4 months later on wire fraud and bank fraud charges related to the Riverstone Holdings appraisal scheme. The ERISA violation was resolved through the civil settlement and a separate Department of Labor penalty rather than a criminal pension charge once prosecutors determined the civil remedy adequately addressed the harm to plan participants. Peter Whitmore, his brother, pleaded guilty to a lesser fraud charge 8 months after that, in exchange for cooperation against Charles. The Whitmore Hotel Group was sold in pieces over the following year. The Scottsdale property first, at a fraction of its fabricated appraisal value, then Sedona, then the smaller properties, to pay down debt, legal fees, and the settlement with the pension plan. Alyssa was never criminally charged. The $940,000 in consulting fees, once investigators dug into it, was determined to be money her father moved to avoid reporting requirements rather than something she'd actively orchestrated, though she was compelled to return the funds as part of a separate civil resolution, and her name still appears in every filing, every reporter's timeline, every version of this story that circulates online. I don't know how she's doing now. I've made a point of not knowing. My mother wore the same gray dress to Northbridge's 10th anniversary dinner 8 months later, the one she'd worn to my almost wedding sweating, cleaned, and pressed like nothing had ever happened to it on that lawn. I asked her once why she kept it instead of throwing it away, and she said something I've thought about since. Because I want to remember that it was never about the dress. I still drive the 6-year-old Honda Accord.